Olá a todos e a todas. Este é o Conversa com Autores, que traz para as telas um bate-papo com colaboradores da CIR Brasil e especialistas brasileiros que nos ajudam a contextualizar textos traduzidos da edição americana. Eu sou Ana Cláudia Ferrari, editora-chefe, e hoje tenho o prazer de conversar sobre direitos indígenas e negócios com as autoras Moira Birss e Kate Finn. Moira é diretora de Clima e Finanças da Amazon Watch, onde trabalha para que o setor financeiro se responsabilize por sua contribuição às violações de direitos indígenas, desmatamento da Amazônia e mudanças climáticas. Kate é diretora executiva da First Peoples Worldwide, onde orienta a organização a trabalhar a partir de uma base de valores indígenas para chegar a um futuro sustentável para todos. No artigo que publicamos na nossa primeira edição, Moira e Kate falam sobre a importância de as empresas e investidores olharem para os direitos indígenas e entenderem que eles estão indissociavelmente ligados à proteção do clima. No momento em que os efeitos das mudanças climáticas se agravam e aumentam as preocupações com o ambiente e a biodiversidade, nada mais oportuno que ler o artigo e falar com Moira e Kate, defensoras que atuam na interseção entre direitos indígenas, direitos humanos, proteção ambiental e responsabilidade dos investidores. Para essa conversa, convidamos também Ana Carolina Alfinito, advogada e socióloga, com ampla experiência de trabalho com organizações indígenas, consultora jurídica da Amazon Watch no Brasil. Essa conversa será feita em inglês, com tradução e legendas em português. So welcome again, Moira, welcome Kate, welcome Ana. It's a great pleasure to be with you today and have in the first issue of Stanford Social Innovation Review Brazil, here, an article discussing critical and urgent issues as indigenous rights, environmental protection, and investor responsibility. In the text, you state that companies should adopt more stringent measures when it comes to the rights of indigenous peoples and tribal communities. So beyond the moral argument of respecting these rights, companies and investors have to look at this and understanding that violating the rights of indigenous peoples and tribal communities implies political, operational, reputational, and legal risks, and huge financial losses, as you show in the article. So I'd like to start with Moira and ask you if you could tell us what was the main driver for you to write the article and why it is so important in a moment where the effects of climate change worsen and are visible everywhere to make clear that environmental protection is deeply attached to the respect to indigenous and tribal people's rights.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Anna, for this opportunity. Really glad to be with you all. The occasion for which we began the article is the fact that the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, which oversees and writes rules and regulates how companies that are publicly traded in the U.S. Operate, and particularly the kinds of information they must disclose, is embarking on a series of new rulemakings where it's contemplating adding additional requirements for disclosure from companies. And so the opportunity we saw was to advocate for disclosures around respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples in that context. But of course, this is an issue that is much broader than the particular moment of the SEC rulemaking process. And that isn't just an issue for companies that are publicly traded in the US, but companies around the world. And it's becoming, as you referenced, even more acute as climate change worsens, and also as climate solutions are ramped up. One of the things that Kate has worked on a lot, and would be great to hear her speak about, is and something that increasingly at Amazon Watch we're having to pay attention to, is that a lot of the minerals that are going into solar panels and batteries and the like, the are located in indigenous territories. And so we're increasingly seeing conflict and problems with companies violating indigenous rights in those areas as well. So it's not just an issue that is about the companies that are harming the climate and the environment, although it certainly is. It's also about the entire world of corporate activity and the need for responsibility, both towards the planet as well as towards the people who live on it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Kate, can you also can you tell us about this approach that Moira mentioned?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the ability to be here and to speak with you. And it's such a pleasure to be able to work with Moira, who has such a deep expertise in this work and really working deeply with frontline communities. And I agree wholeheartedly that, our focus really was on publicly traded companies in the United States. And that was the opportunity that we saw. But we're seeing more and more other standard setting bodies come out with different kinds of criteria for companies to report against. And this is the moment, this really is a moment when we're looking to solve for climate chaos, to say we can't solve it without recognizing indigenous peoples. We can't solve it without recognizing the people on the land. And the best way for companies to move forward is to do that explicitly and not only recognize the indigenous rights risk. There's risk when companies don't solicit free, prior, and informed consent, when they don't listen to what communities need, want, and have. But there's incredible risk in not listening on the other side. Listen, if you want to know if your infrastructure is going to fall through the permafrost due to lower temperatures, the indigenous peoples who live there can tell you. They will know what's going on in the ocean. They know what's going on with the permafrost. They know what's happening on the land. And so there is data. Companies can no longer say there's not data as to what's happening in climate change. No, there is data. It's just a matter of showing companies and asking companies to recognize indigenous peoples and to screen and use indigenous rights risk as a really robust part of their operations.
Right. Okay. Kate, I think I have another question for you. You start the article mentioning the connection of indigenous people to their land. Can you talk a little bit about this, please?
Absolutely. So, of course, there's, millions of indigenous peoples all over the world. And so it's hard to put into words what one commitment is, but one commonality for indigenous peoples around the world is a deep connection to land. And that land is more than its economic use, although it is also economic use. It's about the cultural and spiritual and historical and educational and environmental ties to that land. So in many cases on the public markets, even in the private markets, land is commodified. It becomes a number. But in fact, for indigenous peoples, it's so much more. It's a story. And that's what we need, to integrate as we start solving for climate change, is that story. And the best way to do that is for companies to really understand and to disclose how they are interacting with indigenous peoples. Free, prior, and informed consent is the standard that we use. That's the standard that indigenous peoples expect. And the reason that they do that is because in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that framework is set forth to support indigenous peoples' self-determination, to support indigenous leadership, so that indigenous leaders can say, this is our land, this is where our ancestors are buried, this is not for economic use. Or they can say, here's another aspect of our economic priorities that we would like companies to support. But it's about uplifting indigenous leadership. It's about uplifting priorities and viewing indigenous leadership as opposed to land as solely a commodity.
Right, thank you. Moira, another question for you before I get Anna's comment on a specific topic. Kate has just mentioned legal documents, legal norms, international norms that already exist for protection of this special relationship of indigenous people to their land. In the article, you mentioned documents from the United Nations, from the International Labour Organization. What would be the most fundamental rights guaranteed by them, in your opinion?
Sure. Well, in these international agreements, the core fundamental right that is recognized for Indigenous peoples, in addition to all of the human rights that all of us enjoy, as laid out in the Declaration, the Human Rights Declaration, is the right to self-determination and sovereignty, right? So, as Kate was referencing earlier, Indigenous peoples, need to and should have and have a right to determine what happens in their ancestral territory and with their communities and with their cultures, and that's really based in the right to self-determination and sovereignty. And from those rights, all of these other rights, and all of these sort of ways of understanding how businesses should interact with Indigenous peoples come, right? So they get to determine what happens in their territory, their cultural practices need to be respected, et cetera.
Right. Anna, so when it comes in the specific case of Brazil, where the increase in violence against Indigenous people and environmental activists, the disrespect for the rights of these peoples, the deforestation, the advance of cattle farming, illegal mining, and all the tragedy we are all witnessing, these all grow in the face of a state that turns a blind eye to this and in a way stimulates this catastrophe. How do you see the discussion of respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples by the financial and business sector in Brazil?
Hi, Anna. Thank you for the invitation to be here. So I think saying that government turns a blind eye to these rights violations is indeed quite generous and an understatement, as you yourself said. So what we have today, of course, violence against Indigenous peoples and traditional communities and other underrepresented communities in Brazil is a historical fact. It's not new. But what we do have today that's perhaps new is the fact that we have a convergence between a federal government and a legislature that are actively seeking to reduce and to restrict the land and the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples, and also restrict all sorts of rights, of territorial rights, that somehow block or create obstacles to new extraction in protected territories. So this is what's new. It's this convergence and the strength of these discourses and of this anti-Indigenous and anti-protective, anti-environmental politics. Concerning the respect for Indigenous people's rights, what I see in the day-to-day of my legal practice and also of my research is that national and international corporations, they take advantage of the way that federal government and legislature are weakening the territorial rights of Indigenous peoples. They do turn a blind eye or contribute to human rights violations. So they are actively involved in land grabbing. They're actively involved in the splitting up of local communities, in the pollution of rivers and deforestation. And they are being benefited by a federal government that is not doing what it should be doing to protect these areas. One thing that I think is important for us to mention is that in this historical period, so the judiciary has become an important arena for mobilization of the Indigenous movement and of traditional communities. And the judiciary, despite its limitations, is playing an important role in affirming the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples, of the right to free, prior, and informed consent, expanding these rights to other communities so we can talk about this. And they are creating obstacles to this kind of alliance between capital and an anti-indigenous, anti-environmentalist state.
Back to you. In the article, you mentioned cases of violations or disregard of indigenous people's rights that led to increased legal, political, reputational, and financial operational risks for companies and investors. From cases in Peru, Suriname, Norway, Canada, the US, Colombia, Ecuador, Malaysia, Namibia, Botswana, Mexico. I think you bring several cases in this article, but can you tell us one that Amazon Watch itself got involved?
Sure. Well, and I'd love to also just follow up a little bit on something that Anna said. I think the reference that Anna made to the legal cases and the legal rulings happening in Brazil right now is an example of this business risk that we talk about in the article. Because those cases aren't just coming out of nowhere. Those cases are coming because communities are saying, we are not tolerating this kind of business complicity in our rights abuses, and so we are going to challenge that and take these cases to court, and they're having success, right? And so that's some of that legal risk that we talk about in the article, and it's an example of how if companies are not doing their due diligence and are not from the get-go thinking about who the communities are and places they want to operate and how they're going to respect those rights, then they're going to run into these kinds of obstacles, right? And one example actually from Brazil, it's not one that we talked about in the article because, as I mentioned at the beginning, this article was focused on the current moment in the U.S. of the SEC considering new disclosure rules, and so we were focusing on companies that are publicly traded here in the U.S. because that's the SEC's jurisdiction. But a case that Amazon Watch works in Brazil is one of the company Belo Sun. It's a mining company that's hoping to open a massive gold mine in the Amazon, and communities there have been filing with support from organizations like Amazon Watch, have been filing suits and so far winning them, arguing that the company is not fully respecting their rights, and that has delayed operations. So that's one example, not in the article, but an example related to Brazil. And then another example that we do talk about in the article is of the oil company GeoPark. So this is a company that had been based in Chile, now is headquartered in Bogota, in Colombia, but is registered and is on the New York Stock Exchange, publicly traded in the U.S. And it a few years ago purchased the concession to do exploratory drilling in hopes of extraction in the Peruvian Amazon on the territories of the Achua and Wampis people. The Achua and Wampis people have a history of successfully blocking oil company operations in their territory, specifically in the oil block known as Block 64. And Amazon Watch has worked with these communities for many years in defending their territories. But GeoPark thought that it could have success where others have failed, and purchased this concession and began some exploratory activities. And over several years, the Achua and Wampis filed lawsuits, staged protests, attended shareholder meetings of the company in Santiago, spoke with reporters and organizations like Amazon Watch to help amplify their opposition. And if I'm not mistaken, July of 2020, GeoPark announced that it was withdrawing from the concession, and the Achua and Wampis beat yet another oil company. Now, and this is something that, if I remember correctly, we talk about in the article, that same company, GeoPark, is attempting to do a similar thing in the Colombian Amazon. And so, again, we are supporting the communities who are determined to keep GeoPark out of their territories in the Colombian Amazon.
All right, thank you. Kate, I was going to ask you about one case that First Peoples Worldwide was part of.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, what I'd really like to do is draw on what Moira is saying. These cases are happening. Indigenous peoples around the world are bringing legal cases. They're bringing shareholder cases. They're bringing cases to the United Nations and elsewhere. And a lot of our work in this article is to show businesses, hey, this is in front of your face and this is happening and this is where you need to take note. And so we worked a number of years ago with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe on their work to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline. That pipeline was slated to be built in 2014, and in 2014 the tribe said no. We oppose the route of this pipeline under the river nearest our home for many different reasons, for environmental reasons, for cultural reasons, and we oppose this. And the company was there when the tribe said no, you do not have our consent, and the company moved forward to build the pipeline. Of note, at the time, the company said that the whole pipeline would cost about $3.4 billion. But the pipeline continued, construction continued, and opposition continued. The tribe continued to say no through the media, through the press, through any way they had, through legal cases that were filed. Eventually the Obama administration issued a statement in favor of the tribe. Well, in 2016, there was incredible social conflict. There were thousands of people on and near the construction route opposing and showing their opposition in 2016. And you could watch in the media August, September, October. You could see dogs biting people. You could see where there was military force used against protesters. Well, what's interesting to me is that even though there were ongoing legal cases, even though there was ongoing opposition, the shareholders of the proponent company didn't know about it until it was disclosed in November of 2016. So the company itself never disclosed what was going on to its own shareholders until November of 2016. And I think that is something that companies around the world need to take note of, that shareholders need to take note of, that there really is a material financial risk to not listening to Indigenous peoples, to not respecting their rights. And shareholders need to know. And we know that shareholders now more than ever, especially after destruction of the Yukon Gorge, are watching. They're watching to see how companies act and behave in terms of respecting Indigenous peoples. And so alongside political advocacy and legal advocacy, shareholder advocacy is becoming a very, very strong tool for Indigenous peoples.
Right, okay. Anna, I'd like to ask you, Moira has already brought up an example of a Brazilian case, but Amazon Watch has recently released a report called Complicity in Destruction #4, How Mining Companies and International Investors Drive Indigenous Rights Violations and Threaten the Future of the Amazon. Can you talk a little bit about this report, please?
Yes, of course. So let me just kind of situate this. I think it's important to understand that so what is the historical context for the advance of mining interests within Indigenous territories? So we have an Amazon that has been already largely extracted. Large parts of it have been destroyed. A lot of timber has been extracted from the non-protected areas. The mineral reserves that are outside of protected areas also have owners today. So the last kind of frontiers of high value resources are within Indigenous territories and are within other protected areas. And these places have become sites of intense battles, of violent battles, for the signification, the allocation, and the use of these resources. So the issue of mining interests within Indigenous lands has become increasingly concerning for the National Articulation or Coordination of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, APIB. Over the past years, we have been researching together with APIB what these mining interests represent, the risks that they represent, the kinds of damages that mining has already done within and around indigenous territories. And last year, so we released this report, Complicity and Destruction, which seeks to map these interests, to see what the extent, what the size of mining interests is within indigenous lands, what kinds of damages we can expect, what kinds of resistance indigenous peoples have organized against the encroachment of their territories by international and national mining companies, and to recommend to make recommendations about how these companies and how governments should regulate mining activities. What we found was deeply concerning. So we found nearly 2,500 active mining applications overlapping with nearly 270 indigenous lands around Brazil. So this is very concerning. Why is this concerning? Because all mining in indigenous lands today is illegal in Brazil. One cannot mine, be it small-scale traditional mining or large-scale industrial mining. It's all illegal. But what we found is that government has been registering mining interests within these lands with the expectation that it will be legalized over the upcoming years. So the companies that have their interests within or around indigenous lands have received nearly 55 billion in financing, through banks and investment managers. So there's a lot of international capital that's being invested within these illegal activities. And what we have is local communities together with partners, with NGOs, national and international NGOs that are trying to resist, and to throw these companies out of their territory once and for all. And we have had some important successes in this front. So I think it's important to mention that last year, the Federal Public Prosecutor's Office got a very important ruling in the Regional Federal Court that annuls all mining registrations within and around indigenous territories in the Tucuruí region in Pará. As I mentioned, we have had an expansive interpretation of the right to free, prior, and informed consent, also by regional courts in the Amazon, which say that not only indigenous peoples, but all traditional communities need to be consulted, and they need to be consulted before the first license is issued to these companies. So the moment of consultation is also an open issue that's being discussed within Brazilian courts. And we have had important decisions saying that, especially concerning mining, which is a highly destructive, highly intensive activity, free, prior, and informed consent needs to be previous to all planning of mining, to any kinds of registration of mining interests within indigenous lands. And this is also leading to the annulment of licenses within these protected territories. But just to say that we know that this is a war, that this pressure will not end, but that there are important fronts of resistance that are happening in the territories, in legislature, and also in the judiciary.
Thank you. Oh God, yeah. I have a question to Kate now. So many people are discussing ESG. It's a buzzword nowadays. I'd like to hear you a little bit about ESG risk indicators related to human rights and sustainability.
Absolutely. So you're right. There's a lot of talk on all sides of ESG these days. And I think if I'm viewing things solely from an indigenous lens, I think it's great. I think that this is what we need, is to have the hard conversations about what ESG really means and how it is that companies can put forth their commitments and how investors and shareholders can hold them to their commitments. So, I think where we are in this space is that ESG is not a perfect tool, but it's the best tool we have to measure commitments. So I think that there's a lot there in terms of how civil society, how indigenous peoples can really hold corporations and investors to their commitments on that. And I think too, just to add on a little further, as I said, my whole work is on Indigenous and really looking at Indigenous rights risk. And one thing I tell people all the time is that, the Indigenous runs all the way through ESG, through environmental, social, and governance. In the environmental space, biodiversity, climate commitments, climate-related commitments, Indigenous peoples are there. Indigenous peoples have a lot to say. Indigenous peoples, of course, steward more than 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. Social license to operate. How is it that companies are able to be on the land? This is true for all communities, but in particular for Indigenous communities, social license to operate is free, prior, and informed consent. So have companies really operationalized what free, prior, and informed consent said? And as Anna just said, prior, how is it that they're making sure that they're speaking with Indigenous communities and integrating their perspectives and priorities far before project design? And then on the governance side too, many companies have commitments to DEI, have commitments to procurement, have commitments to all these different things. Well, where are the numbers? Who are they hiring? How are they supporting communities? And are they following the commitments they put out? It's really easy to say, we want to be part of the solution, but how are they doing that? When are they doing that? And why are they doing that? So I think, for all of its challenges and for all of the different ways that ESG is, becoming politicized and being a part of a bigger conversation, it really is the best way to measure values. And it's the best way to understand where companies are at in terms of putting their words to work in terms of their values.
Right. Thank you. So, oh my God, it's a great overview of the topics you approach in the article. Everyone is really invited to read in the first issue of the Brazilian edition. And so for now, I'd like your final remarks from the three of you to the readers in Brazil, who are certainly people interested in knowing more and help finding solutions for the most pressing social and environmental challenges we are all facing. So how would you invite people to not only read your article, but engage with the pressing issues you raise in the article? Moira, please, can you start?
Sure. Well, I think, where people are situated is really important. So, if you work in a company, how can you be engaging with the practices and policies of your company to ensure that throughout business operations that Indigenous peoples and their rights are being respected? If you work in government, it's a complicated moment. I'll let Anna maybe speak more to that, but how are you ensuring that the actual laws of the land, like the fact that mining is illegal in the Amazon Indigenous territories, that the law is being upheld? And in civil society, how are you supporting organizations like a PB to do their work, whether it's through donations or social support on social media, or how you're voting? I think all of those pieces are really important. It's it's going to take all of us to really create a world that is healthy and sustainable for all, and where the rights of everyone in all communities, particularly those most marginalized, are truly respected.
Thank you. Kate, can you give us your final remarks, please?
Absolutely. It's hard to build on what Moira just said, because I absolutely agree that it takes every single one of us to do our part to build a sustainable world. And I would say your first step, wherever you sit, civil society, government, politics, wherever you are, is to ask the first question that we ask in the due diligence section of the article, which is, how does your business model implicate the Indigenous world, Indigenous peoples, or Indigenous issues? Really look and see how it is that what you are doing implicates Indigenous peoples, and do that research and find that out, and then take the next step. I think that is what is most important. Can you support Indigenous data getting into your organization? Can you support the understanding of your organization about Indigenous rights risk? There's a moral case to not violating human rights, and that is important. And it's important to understand that as companies encroach on these last frontiers, as Anna said, it will be a business case and there will be a fight. And there's a need for all of us to know where and when and how the work that we do intersects with Indigenous peoples.
Thank you. Anna, can you?
Sure. So as you know, Anna, it's very difficult to have any kind of optimism in Brazil today. But of course, we do hope and bet on and work for structural political change in our country as soon as possible. I think as a part of Brazilian civil society or of global civil society, we need to understand that what we're watching today in Brazil, as well as in other countries, is a very systemic restructuring of this multiculturalist, multi-ethnic pact, right? That was made in Brazil in the late 1980s with our constitution, in other Latin American countries a little bit later, and other waves of constitutionalism. So everything that we have conquered in terms of pluricultural or national recognition, in terms of the protection of the environment, of nature, the existence of refuges and of protected territories and of places where living can be thought and done otherwise in different terms as those that we know as Western societies. All this is at risk right now, serious risk. And I think it's important that we understand the structural dimensions of this, but that we also understand the more specific political and legal and cultural mechanisms through which it operates. So we have today in Congress in Brazil at least 2 bills that are being analyzed, which are of extreme importance to the future of the Amazon and to the future of the country and to the future of the world, which are the Federal Bill 191, which speaks about permitting mining on Indigenous lands. As I said, all mining today is illegal on Indigenous territories. What this bill tries to do is to regulate mining, to make it possible and legal. And there's also Bill 460, which is about reducing environmental licensing restrictions, about making the licensing process easier, with less criteria, with lower thresholds of evaluation by federal government. So these are the political battles of our day that speak about, the advancement of new extractivism and about the kind of resistance that we're going to be able to organize against this advance. And I think it's crucial that society look at these bills, as indicators of where the struggles, where the war is being fought, and value and support the organizations that are directly involved in these battles. So, of course, the National Coordination of Indigenous Peoples, APIB, but also, the landless movement, the Quilombola movement. So we need to listen to these voices to understand where what's at stake in these battles, so that we can collectively kind of link up to each other and start thinking about alternative futures. This is extremely urgent.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure this is a hard conversation that we all need to have, as you said, and there's so much to be done. So, and your article is surely a great way to start the reflections for people who are not really aware of everything you bring. So thank you so much for the 3 of you. It's been great. And let's keep fighting, right?
Yes, thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Kate and Moira.